These are the 10 biggest downfalls of UFC fighters. We start with a recent and rather painful example of someone who used to be feared as a force of nature at 155. Tony Ferguson. Not too long ago, Tony Ferguson, despite never holding the undisputed title, was regarded as one of the greatest lightweights ever. He was on a massive winning streak and considered Khabib's chief rival. But you meet your match sooner or later. And for Tony, Gaethje was the guy who ended his long win streak and his career. I know he's still competing today, but the person who lost to Paddy is nowhere close to the Tony Ferguson we knew. After the Justin Gaethje beating, Charles Oliveira mangled his arm, Beneil Dariush shook his confidence, and last, Michael Chandler cracked his chin with maybe the most horrifying knockout of the year. After going through that murderous low and losing what was left of his prime, we are left with the Tony Ferguson of today, a forgotten great at lightweight who now ties BJ Penn for the longest losing streak. And sad thing is, Tony is still not ready to call it quits, so this downfall will continue to get worse. Dominic Reyes. I'm getting Johnny Hendricks vibes already. Like GSP, Jon Jones is widely considered one of the greatest fighters ever. And at UFC 247, a guy by the name of Dominic Reyes came this close to beating him inside the cage. Reyes was so close that even Jon Jones himself doubted his chances. And just like UFC 167, the judges, for some reason, awarded the fight to the champion. And if you watch closely, you can see Reyes' soul leaving his body when Bruce Buffer announces Jones as the victor. A lot of people thought Reyes had won, and we all saw it live. Jon Jones had indeed met his match in Dominic Reyes, but he didn't get his hands raised. Dominic Reyes came this close, but he walked out of the cage without being declared a winner, and that crushed him. Since the controversial loss to Jon Jones, Reyes has lost 3 times, all defeats by knockout, while Jon Jones is the current heavyweight champion. This goes to show that the judges sitting ringside have their own methods of ruining careers. Dominic Reyes didn't lose his physical gifts and attributes, but he came agonizingly close to victory and lost his way. Ben Askren. During his prime, Ben Askren was considered the best fighter outside of the UFC. Dana White didn't really like him, but everyone else, from the hardcore fans to Joe Rogan, was hoping that someday Askren would compete in the UFC. Luckily for us, Askren was traded over to UFC in exchange for Demetrius Johnson. Better than never, for us at least. For Askren, not so much. Askren was known for wrestling his opponents and keeping it up until he broke them. The question was whether he'd be able to do that to UFC caliber opponents. He tried to against Robbie Lawler, but Ruthless dumped him on his head and beat the heck out of him until Askren pulled off a miracle sub. A little bit of hope endured because while Askren was a bloody mess, he did win his debut. But he did not win the next one, as Jorge Masvidal, who promised to break his face, did exactly that in just 5 seconds. Askren was effectively turned into a UFC trivia answer, and after getting submitted by Demian Maia for his second consecutive loss, Ben was released from the UFC. And I know he lost to Masvidal and Maia, nothing to be ashamed of, but Ben then tried his luck at boxing. Ben Askren was the first UFC victim of Jake Paul, and he started the trend, so he ends up on this list by default. Tyron Woodley. During his title reign, Woodley often reminded us that he knocked out the most vicious welterweight champion in record time. And he wasn't lying. Robbie Lawler was scary, and Woodley beat him for the title, and then went on to actually defend the belt a few times, which is a pretty impressive accomplishment. He wasn't supremely dominant, but with a well-rounded skill set and ridiculous attributes, Woodley was hard to beat. But at UFC 235, Kamaru Usman made it look easy, almost too easy. And I think it was the first clinch where Woodley truly realized what he was up against. T-Wood was already criticized as being passive in his fights, but after Usman ran over him, Woodley went from being passive to straight up frozen. Woodley lost 15 straight rounds, and in his last UFC fight, he was knocked by Vicente Luque. I'm sure Dana White was happy about the way his career came to an end, but even Dana, and the biggest Woodley critic, had to feel sorry for the guy when Jake Paul added him to his YouTube Shorts highlight reel. Knocked out by Jake Paul while having "I love Jake Paul" tattooed on him? Feels bad, man. Darren Till. After Michael Bisping retired, the UFC needed a star from the UK. Luckily for them, Darren Till was a sufficiently popular prospect from the United Kingdom, and he sort of resembled Conor McGregor during his rise to fame. The self-belief of Darren Till was something else, and he considered MMA the be-all, end-all of his life. Everything else, including his family, was of secondary importance.
7 months pregnant, I don't really care. I've got a daughter in Brazil right now who I haven't seen for one yet, I don't really care.
He didn't really care. All that mattered to Till was legacy and greatness, and he was given an early chance to prove himself. At UFC 228, he faced Tyron Woodley for the title, and in the first round, Till was credited with exactly 0 significant strikes. He had to step up and do something in the second round, but when he tried to, he was countered by a T-Wood bomb. Knocked down for the first time in his career, Till was subsequently battered by Woodley before tapping out. The loss to T-Wood probably traumatized Darren Till because he was no longer obsessed with MMA. He started losing more, talking less, and barely fought. Currently, Darren Till is not even in the UFC, and looking at his recent interviews and his current aspirations, I doubt he's in a hurry to return to the place where he lost his spirit. Chris Weidman. From the very start of his MMA career, Chris Weidman envisioned facing and beating Anderson Silva for the middleweight title. At UFC 162, Weidman achieved what he set out to do: defeat Anderson Silva and end his 16-fight UFC win streak, take his belt, but most impressively, he knocked him out cold. To beat Anderson Silva, you had to be really special, and Weidman fit the bill. He was undefeated, decent in all areas of MMA, and he just had that aura. The aura of someone who beat the greatest middleweight of all time. Weidman managed 3 impressive title defenses, and in his 4th attempt, he faced his buddy-turned-rival, Luke Rockhold. Whatever special powers Weidman had acquired from Anderson Silva, Rockhold beat that out of Weidman at UFC 194. That ground and pound was straight up horrific, and I was amazed that Chris actually stood up from the stool for the 4th round, but he knew what he was walking into. Weidman retained his skills, and his technique did not regress, but his durability was simply not there anymore. And just like Johnny Hendricks, Weidman went on a brutal losing skid, and only recently has he got a W. Hailed as the next Anderson Silva at 185 at one point, and now he is celebrating an eye poke win, and he's still not going to retire, so to be continued. Ronda Rousey. Allow me to take you back to 2015. Ronda Rousey was not just the women's bantamweight champion, she was the MMA GOAT, possibly boxing GOAT, a once-in-a-lifetime cultural icon, and finally, a once-ever combat goddess. Mind you, this wasn't fan hyperbole. Joe Rogan was the guy saying all this, and you had to admit, she was pretty impressive, like finishing almost everyone in the first round scale of impressive, but on the biggest stage of her life. UFC 193, she was on the receiving end of one of the most brutal knockouts in MMA. A kick to the head, and all the myths and legends surrounding her became memes. She was not seen or heard from for a very, very long time. The interview with Ellen DeGeneres was concerning, but the UFC brought her back to face Amanda Nunes, as she still had one big PPV left in her semi-retired career. The defending champion got little to no acknowledgement during the build, and the literal poster of the event was all about her. She's back. Ronda Rousey was back for a grand total of 50 seconds as Amanda beat her even worse than Holly did and sent her off to retirement. The epitome of WMMA to barely remember a few years later. That's a once-ever downfall, I'd say. Johnny Hendricks. Not a single media member at UFC 167 scored the main event for GSP. GSP, who was undoubtedly the greatest welterweight and a top pound-for-pound fighter, had lost that fight, no matter what the judges had to say. And the welterweight to beat him was Johnny Hendricks. Back then, GSP was so dominant, and it was hard to fathom that anyone would be able to compete with him. But Hendricks did, took him down and even hurt him. The decision was read in favor of GSP, but with Rush taking time off from the sport, Hendricks was almost destined to be the next champion. He did become champion at UFC 171, but then something happened to him. Maybe his body gave up due to the weight, maybe some USADA meddling, maybe he lost his hunger, but Hendricks was never able to compete at that level ever again. After losing the title to Robbie Lawler, the scale became his biggest rival. Hendricks was not able to make weight, and even worse, the guy could not get a win streak going. The welterweight monster who beat GSP was 1-5 in his last 6, and even at 185, the scales won. I imagine the UFC was furious with him because the last we saw of Hendricks, he was erased from the UFC by Paulo Costa. Renan Barro. Once upon a time, Renan Barro was hailed as the Jose Aldo of 135. Talk about a burden to shoulder, but Barro, unbeaten in 10 years, lived up to that greatness. A win streak of 34 fights, and at 135, no one had the answer for Renan Barro. Barro was so great that the company promoted him from interim champion to undisputed champion, and no one had a problem with it. But at UFC 173, Barro faced TJ Dillashaw, a lamb he was supposed to slaughter. But TJ defied expectations and accomplished one of the biggest upsets ever. Dillashaw nearly had him out in the first round, and Barro only barely survived. Survived and ended up as a punching bag for the next 20 minutes before Dillashaw knocked him out in the 5th. That was bad enough, and it only got worse. Given his dominance, Barro was offered an immediate rematch with TJ, but the weight cut went terrible. The former champion banged his head on the bathtub and withdrew from the fight. The eventual rematch with TJ was another sustained beating and marked the end of his elite days. He won just one more time after TJ battering, and currently, Barro is fighting for some regional promotion in Kuwait, and he still ain't winning. BJ Penn. In many ways, BJ Penn was the OG cautionary tale in MMA. This guy was so talented and fearless that he fought Lyoto Machida at heavyweight and became the second only two-weight world champion, capturing the belts in 2 of the most savage divisions, lightweight and welterweight. Penn had to give up on his welterweight dreams after a loss to GSP at UFC 94. But at 155, he was still pretty much untouchable and beat up his generational peers no problem. But when the next generation showed up, even a motivated BJ Penn was not able to keep up. The sport had passed him by, but Penn was not ready to accept it, and he kept chasing a victory. My guy went from fighting a competitive match against Frankie Edgar to losing a clear decision against Dennis Seaver. Penn was also knocked out in the parking lot by some random guy, but we don't talk about that.